So on today's Lessons in Leadership, we've got Ruston Smith. Ruston is a serial non-executive director, independent trustee and chairman. And Ruston, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul. Looking forward to it.
So Ruston, I guess the first question I've asked everybody in this series is, could you spend a couple of minutes just talking us through your career and kind of how you've reached the position you've reached today, so that some of our listeners who are on a similar career path can get some insight as to how you've made it to where you are?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So many years ago now, in fact, decades ago, I sort of got into accounting, and then I fell into a specialism, pensions and pension fund management. And at quite an early age, I became group pensions director and manager of a large FTSE 250. And then through development and opportunities that came my way, I then sort of extended that role, and that's quite typical, to insurance for the group. I even became head of property. I became the legal director. I eventually became, the PLC company secretary, having done an MBA, which was fantastic, great experience, and really broadened my mind and the way I look at the world. And then I was recruited by Tesco to be their group pensions director. After a period of time, I also became head of insurable risk. And then beyond that point, we decided to set up an in-house investment management business. This is just to manage the assets of the Tesco PLC pension scheme. So I set that up. The sponsor was Sir Terry Leahy at the time, who was the CEO. I became the CEO of that. And also then on the back of that, I also got some people responsibilities. In 2017, having picked up a number of sort of non-executive positions, I became the chair, for example, of the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association. And I also got onto the Master Trust Board for Standard Life as a non-exec there, and then also became a non-exec director of JP Morgan Asset Management. I decided in 2017 to take the plunge, leave executive life behind me, and try and build a portfolio. And I've tried to do that, and I've tried to diversify and sort of build on my experience, but always with the aim of making sure I contribute, but equally that I can learn from others as well. So having really good fun working with some fantastic people.
And what would you say have been sort of the big challenges along the way in building that portfolio?
Well, I think in terms of building the portfolio as a non-exec, I think the key thing is not to jump at the very first thing. It is to be quite disciplined, to think about, what is my experience, what are my strengths, but importantly, what do I want to do? What really excites me, and where do I think I can make a good contribution? And some of the time, it is more important to say no to opportunities as it is to say yes, because you can get in a position where you just want to build out that portfolio quite quickly. So I think for me, for example, what was really helpful was, Tesco, my employer at the time, allowed me to, build up my experience and knowledge by taking on a couple of non-exec positions at that time. And really just working it through and, getting advice along the way.
And what have been some of the sort of key leadership lessons you've learned throughout your career then?
Well, I think the first one is, and this is a typical example today of that, is change is continuous. It is significant. So if you look back over the last sort of 12 months or more, we live in an incredibly dynamic world. And yes, coronavirus, COVID is one of those, huge impacts. But actually, if you look at technology itself and how it changes the modern world, the economy, global economies, it is significant. And so I guess that, one of the key lessons that I've had, and I learned this partly through the MBA, is to have a very wide filter and look very, very broadly at the world, so that when you come down to the entity for which you're employed or you're supporting, then actually you can see it very much in that global context. And also you can see the dynamics of things changing in the environment to really help you think through, not just about, what are the opportunities, but also what are the challenges, and importantly, what are the solutions. I think the other thing for me, people are everything. You know, getting a good team behind you, having a good complement of skills, experience, and huge diversity of thinking is really important. And to get those people working effectively as part of a team significantly increases your chance of success.
Okay, and it's interesting there you bring up COVID and the challenge that that's creating to the global economy at the moment. How have you found transitioning from a workforce sort of exclusively based in offices or premises across the world to working in a digital environment, and especially as a sort of non-executive director?
So I think that, you know, the transition has been effective. So if I look at the businesses and pension funds that I work with, if I look at, you know, what they were doing in a normal office environment out in the broader world and where we are today, we've done everything as we would have expected. It's quite interesting, really. You know, if you go back and you look at the consultancies that were always talking about business continuity plans, but you always wondered, would they ever work? And of course, people did role plays to check that they did. I think that it's been one of the greatest successes in that we moved from being in the office one day to working, you know, collaboratively together effectively the next, all from home, you know, in very different parts of the world, not to mention different parts of the UK. I think the real challenge, though, is the softer side. The problem I find is that everything feels a little bit more formal. You would normally have walked down a corridor, knocked on somebody's door, or if it's open plan, just tapped on the shoulder, had a coffee, and you could have those, you know, very important informal conversations. It's much more difficult because either you've got to book a meeting to have a call, or you have some kind of Zoom meeting as well. And, you know, I do find that that's much more formal than you would like. So I think there's a lot lost. I think the other question is, particularly with new people joining businesses, you know, how do you help them feel and taste the culture of the business? You know, how do you help them get a sense of true collaboration within that business? I think it's really difficult. And I know that, you know, many senior people are working very hard to look at different ways to do that. But I do think that's quite a significant challenge.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The points you bring up there are points that various people who we've interviewed on for this show over the last, you know, few weeks have said exactly the same sort of thing. Like Phil Jones at Brother brought up that formality piece that you just mentioned there. You know, one of the things he said is normally you walking around and you can see people and you can see those who are looking a bit down or look like they, you know, might need a pep talk or whatever. You can have those conversations and really see from their body language how they react, which you just can't do via video. You've got to book a time to speak to people, and it all just seems a little bit more formal rather than being able to be a bit more spontaneous.
Yeah, I agree, Paul. And I think the other thing is that, you know, we're all very conscious that, you know, some of us are very fortunate to have, you know, a house with a garden maybe, but many people, you know, have got, you know, maybe flats, apartments, they don't have a garden. It's not that easy. They've got young children, they've got to teach them. It's really, really hard. And I think that with the pressures of the world at the moment, you know, you can see that people can quite easily become mentally unwell. So the question is for businesses, and all the ones that I work for, is how do you support them in the very best way that you can, to be there for them when you need to be, and obviously to listen and to support them where you can. It's really, really tough. I think resilience at the moment has never been tested as much as it is today.
No, and one of the other points that people have brought up as well as we've been doing some of these interviews is creativity. So it's harder to get that collaborative, creative, innovative type approach via video because you're not there in the room. And although you can do brainstorming sessions and try and come up with new ideas via video, it's not quite the same as being there in person.
No, that's right. It is hard. I think that people are finding ways around that because, you know, I mean, essentially one of the interesting things about Zoom is when you're in a room, you just have this kind of informal conversation that happens. there's some formality about Zoom, but I think equally there's a consciousness that you need to make sure that you create space for everybody to participate in the conversation. And you hope that perhaps people that were quieter, who might have, you know, brilliant ideas, are brought in and they can be listened to and can feel confident about that. But I agree, it's really hard. I think people are trying really in the best way that they can under the circumstances. And of course, the only way to do that is to get back in the office or get back to some kind of normality where we can literally work together.
Yeah, and you mentioned there, as you were talking as well, Ruston, about resilience and it never been more important. What keeps you going through the toughest periods? How do you maintain that resilience as leader?
I think the first thing is I try and keep my feet on the ground. And what I mean by that is just recognize, you know, everyday life, everyday people doing what they're doing. And the reason I say that is because there is always a risk that you get so focused, so siloed to a particular challenge or objective, and perhaps it's not one that's easy, that you can go down quite a dark tunnel. And by actually just recognizing we're in this very unusual world right now, and we're all in it together, kind of helps you just make sense of that. I think the other thing for me is, you know, people, by sharing problems, getting different points of view, always allows you to have hope that you're in it together, you're working as a team. People have got, you know, different views of the world, and they will come up with different solutions to different problems. So it's not as if anybody owns a single objective. I think that, you know, I'm hoping that through what we're going through at the moment, you know, we will come through with a better sense of team spirit and collaboration. And in that way, for me, that makes me feel stronger. It makes me feel more positive, and it makes me feel as though I'm part of something as opposed to something that I'm in on my own.
And how do you go about evaluating yourself as a leader then?
So I have to say that, you know, I probably got better at this as I've got older. Just
I think we all have to, don't we?
Yeah. So I do reflect a lot at the moment. Well, I've reflected a lot for, you know, for a number of years, but I think you tend to get better at it, I think anyway, over time. And just probably recognizing that you don't always get stuff right. You know, it's about doing the very best you can. As I said right at the start, things are changing so rapidly. It's about continuously learning and improving and doing your very best. And so for me, it's that sort of period of self-reflection where I can get feedback. That's always very helpful, checking in with people, understanding what I could do better. And then the other test really is the extent to which people will listen. I think that when people stop listening, that is a very clear indicator, to me anyway, that perhaps my leadership, and I say leadership more broadly because it's never about one person, it's about a group of people sharing a vision and working together towards that to make it happen.
And actually, that was going to be one of my sort of follow-on questions from that is, what do you think and how do you recognize when your leadership is becoming less effective?
So I think it is when people listen less. I think, you know, leaders would find it much harder to take people with them, which is very, very important in terms of trying to deliver a vision with a team, with a business. So I think, you know, you should be able to sense that your ability to lead and your leadership in itself is diminishing if you're unable to take those people with you and make that real difference. I think the other thing is you tend to know yourself through an increasing lack of confidence, perhaps, that you know, your leadership isn't what it was or what it should be, I should say. And so again, it's these points about self-reflection and being honest, because, you know, nobody's perfect. You know, leadership is really quite difficult. There's some huge responsibilities, not just to a business, but to the people around you, you know, to the employees that you work with, to stakeholders of that business, it's really important to understand what matters most to them and to work with them through those challenges and be honest. And I think most importantly, be yourself.
Yeah, I think that's key. Really, it's that understanding of oneself and understanding of one's limitations, but also understanding your strengths and surrounding yourself with people who complement that.
Exactly that, Paul. I mean, to get the right team around you, and not individuals that on their own are brilliant. It's about getting the right people around you with the right diversity of thinking, the right skills and experience that importantly work well together. Mm-hmm. And so, that's the difference sometimes between success and failure, in my view.
Absolutely. And I think that's something you learn over your career as well. I mean, we joked earlier, that you learn over time how to be a better leader. I think as a Yorkshireman, I would disagree with you when you say nobody's perfect, because clearly those of us from God's own county know that we are. However, even we accept that you don't get it right all the time, and that you do have to adjust and reflect and move forward in order to win together as a team.
Yeah, well, Paul, I don't know if you know, I am from Yorkshire.
So well, I know, which is why I was surprised that you were saying there's nobody perfect.
I am far from that. So if there was an opposite, I'd be that.
I think it's good to be able to laugh at oneself as well.
I do that quite frequently too.
Who do you most admire as a leader, and why?
So I think I admire a number of different leaders for different reasons. Again, coming back to the point that perhaps there isn't, a single individual that's brilliant at everything. And I suppose that, not to sort of think of the people that I've worked with, let's just take it more broadly. I think, the people that I admire, for example, Barack Obama. Now, you might say the obvious choice, but the reason I would choose him as somebody that I really admire is not just because, he has, in my view, a very clear vision, but also what I really admire in him is his humility and importantly, his humor. It was interesting, I was in quite an intense session not so long ago. And when we got to the end of it, we just had the feedback. And people might have said, well, it was a really clear communication, it was, clear vision, strategy, whatever. And what came out is, there was humor in the day. And that helped us to relax and get to the right place in the right way. Other people that I really admire, I think that Angela Merkel is incredibly resilient. And, if I think of authentic leaders, she's kind of one of those. She's a problem solver. I think she's calm, she's focused. Christine Lagarde, president of the ECB. So I listened to her being interviewed on Bloomberg probably about a month ago now, but I had thought about this in her myself. But she said that one of her greatest learnings of leadership was to listen. And again, when I think of her and the experiences that I've had of her when I've seen her on different stages and in different positions, I think that listening is incredibly important. And then finally, okay, I'll bring it back to the UK. The really clear, simple message, but David Attenborough on climate change, we listen to him, we respect him. He has huge credibility, but he helps us all understand something fundamentally important to the world in a way that we can all get. And we all understand. You cannot really challenge, the message he's trying to get across to us. And again, I think that ability to communicate really clearly and again, take people with you is just so important.
And I really like the part that you mentioned around listening. I think it's a key skill in business that many people overlook. And I remember my first boss 20 years ago. I think it was about my second day in the job, and he told me, he said, look, Paul, he said, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them in that order.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Yeah, I agree, Paul. And I suppose that the times when I might have been more effective, it's really when I've taken the time to listen before you start moving forward. There's always a pressure, I think, when you're given an objective to think, okay, I need to crack on because by Q1 I've got to show some kind of deliverable. But in some of the more challenging things that I've had to do, if I'm honest, that involve different stakeholders with very clear interests that might be different to the approach that I'm being asked to take. One of the most important things to me has been to sit, listen, and understand where they are coming from, as opposed to where we might want to go, and then just start to understand, is there some kind of middle ground where we can build consensus, where we can actually deliver what we want, but in a way that everybody can accept. That doesn't mean to say that you please everybody and everybody gets what they want. It's just trying to find the best approach to get to where you need to be. So I agree with you, Paul, on the listening and really understanding other people's points of view.
And have you come across a situation where you had to get something done and you had to achieve something, but actually the stakeholders didn't agree and didn't want to go forward? And how did you overcome that if that was the case?
Yeah, I won't go into specifics, but I do have a very good example of that, where I was asked to make a change that was necessary for the business, but something perhaps that those that participated and this directly affected would not want that to happen. And they were then represented by unions and so forth. It was important to deliver this change, but for me, I knew that the only way I could do that was to truly understand what mattered most to the people it affected, what was the difference I could make to make this change more palatable to them, and then influence the business to help us get to a place where, on balance, we got the right outcome for the business, but importantly, we got the right outcome for those people that it affected. And that worked well, and that will always stay with me because it was quite challenging, but I built some really good, strong friendships through that I might not have expected to do. Because part of the way through that, by listening, you build trust and credibility, and you're more likely to succeed with them than being against them and trying to force something through.
What would you say is the most overrated leadership quality, and why do you think that?
So I can say this because I'm a Yorkshire guy who isn't this, but sort of hyper intelligence, right? So, I think there might be a perception that you're going to have a high IQ and you're going to be hyper intelligent to be a good leader. But actually, if you look at some of the humble beginnings of some of the biggest leaders in the world that have made the biggest change, and you look at their journey, that really hasn't been important. They haven't come out from a top university with a top degree and then done a master's and all the rest of it. They've just got this innate sort of quality and the ability to have a vision and to have the excitement within them to take people with them and to make that change. And so I think that, that's probably one of the most sort of overrated skills, if you like, or qualities that might be perceived out there.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, for me, leadership is so many different facets of it, and there are so many different things that can go wrong with leaders, and it's a really fine balance on charisma, for example. Charisma is great, and you need it to some degree to take people with you and to be successful. However, too much of it can be quite destructive for an organization.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, on the basis that we're all working with, everyday people, and our customers are everyday people, it is really important, I think, to make sure that we have humility, we listen, we learn, and that we're pragmatic, quite honestly. and just do the right thing. I think, if we can do that as leaders, then, we're halfway there. Creativity, having a good vision, and clear communication is important. Not everybody has that, but they manage to lead because they have certain qualities. And I think, Paul, this goes back to the earlier conversation we're having about getting that team around you. So, some people will be great at some things and not so great at others. So if you can build a team around you that basically complements the whole, and allows you to have the skills, experience, and diversity to help you do the best you can as a team collaboratively with your stakeholders and customers and so forth, then I think the probability of success is going to be higher.
I completely agree. The reality is no leader has ever achieved anything on their own. However, there's an awful lot of biographies and autobiographies out there, and if you read them and if you believe them, there's a lot of people who've achieved a hell of a lot on their own. Yeah,
absolutely. No, I agree. I think the other thing is don't be fearful of failing as well, because again, when you listen to some of the the biggest leaders, most successful leaders, they will tell you quite passionately at their failures and almost are proud of it, because those failures have taught them the lessons that have probably made them the success they are today. But that's only because they took those learnings and they put them into practice in the future.
Yeah, and you know what? It's really interesting if you look at the private equity world and the investments that they make, and if you look at UK private equity versus US private equity, US private equity firms like investing in entrepreneurs who've had other ventures which haven't necessarily been successful, but they can show where they went wrong and what they've learned from it. Whereas over here in the UK, we still have a preference to invest in entrepreneurs who've been successful and maybe not necessarily those who haven't. And I just think it's an interesting difference in mindset.
Yeah, and it probably comes back to maybe some cultural thing about risk aversion, I guess. But as you quite rightly say, I think you'll have people who are quite lucky and have an idea and they'll be successful forever. But more often than not, we all go through difficult times and challenges, things that didn't work out. And certainly entrepreneurs, they have to have resilience, because the probability of success in the long run is usually quite low. But they keep trying and they find something that really works for them, and then they are successful. If you think about the global economy, we rely on entrepreneurs that put their own money at risk, and also their confidence and resilience to make things work when it's continuously challenging.
Okay, Ruston, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. Really enjoyed it. Great conversation. Thank you.
Let's speak again soon. Take care.
All right. Thanks then. Bye.